This episode of the show is brought to you from the salesman.org HubSpot studio. Coming up on today's episode of the Sales Leadership Show.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that relationship building from a team perspective is great. And when you know your team at that different level of depth, you have an idea of the perspective of where they're coming from, even in conversation and communication. I think there's a lot of really big positives that can be taken in terms of post-COVID, the impact that it's had on business structures and the way that we operate as businesses.
Hello Sales Nation, my name is Will Barron and welcome to today's episode of the Sales Leadership Show. In today's episode we have Seona Tully. She's a sales director over at HubSpot. And on today's episode we're getting into how COVID has changed sales. We get some excellent case studies and data from HubSpot, and we also cover some data from the HubSpot Sales Enablement Survey, which you can find in the show notes of this episode. There's tons to go at, tons of value, and so let's jump right in. Seona, welcome to the Sales Leadership Show.
Thank you so much, Will. Great to be here.
It's great to have you on. Okay, so we're going to dive into how COVID has changed sales. Well, I'll pose this to you in a second, whether you think it has or it hasn't. We're going to look at some, hopefully some case studies from HubSpot itself. We'll look at some data from a recent HubSpot Sales Enablement Survey. But I think the place where we should start this conversation, Seona, is with a number that shocked me, right? The survey said that under half, 46% of businesses, I'm quoting here, have made changes to enable successful remote work. Now, two things here. One, did that number freak you out that only 46% of businesses have made these changes? And what did you do over at HubSpot when I guess all of a sudden you were just told one day that your team doesn't come to work anymore?
Yeah, absolutely. The number really does shock me. And to be honest, Will, I think it's a changing number. I think if we rerun this survey in 12 months' time, we'd be in a very different scenario. Most companies have realized at this point in time that they need to adapt the way that they're working. But yeah, let's dig into the data a little bit and how we dealt with it here at HubSpot. I mean, we were pretty lucky already at HubSpot. We were on the right track. So from the time I started in HubSpot about 8.5 years ago now, I believe we're a very flexible working environment already.
Sure.
So we already had many of the team working from home a couple of days a week. I certainly leveraged that. And even before COVID, we had about 10% of the employees working remotely. So we were fairly remote friendly, is probably a nice way to put it, before the pandemic. When COVID first hit, it was definitely a shock. We shifted to remote very, very quickly. Needed a few big changes. So, of course, technology, people, culture, what were we going to do from that perspective? And from a technology perspective, as I mentioned, we were fairly lucky. We had a lot of the tech stack in place. Mm-hmm. We leveraged a lot of our own software, of course, and we didn't have to make sweeping changes there. I think most of our changes came on the people pillar as such was a bit more complex. It was new for everyone, new for managers. It was certainly new for all of the team that were managing this. And it wasn't just working remote. It was coupling that with the pandemic and how people were feeling in a pandemic. So we took two main viewpoints or guiding principles, if you want to call it that. The first was leading with empathy. So that was literally everything we heard in our manager meetings, all the director meetings, working with customers, working with each other, with colleagues. And that was huge. And, as a parent, I certainly appreciated that one as well, because I felt I was in the receiving end of that, as well as, of course, managing with empathy with my team. And the second big one was communication. So, how would we communicate with the team? How would we ensure that people received really regular communication and that they felt comfortable, that they knew what was coming? Of course, there's a lot of unknown in a pandemic. So we tried to take that away from the work environment and maybe over communicate as such.
Is there anything you did to implement this? We all understand the empathy side of things, so we can touch on that if you like, but I feel like the communication side of things is interesting here. Is there anything that you used, any tools, any best practices from your own perspective to over communicate with your team who perhaps were used to once an office environment and are now stranded at the kitchen table?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've always used Zoom, for example, in HubSpot or some form of online meeting software. So that was normal. We definitely flexed a bit more to video. So with the video or recordings from a messaging perspective, it gave people who were working from home, maybe people who had families at home, time to actually view the recordings in their own time. Sure. It gave them time to listen to the recording, process, and come back with questions. I think a lot of people maybe didn't have their questions ready if they were hearing a message in the moment in a team meeting, but using a recording allowed them to process and then come back with ideas, questions, or any points on that. So that was really helpful for us. We also used, obviously, our frontline sales managers to tailor the message. So there was a lot of communication to our global teams, and some of that communication was the same across all countries, but it may have been different to receive in Dublin versus Japan versus the US. So our frontline managers got a lot of training on, how to communicate with their teams, and also some of the things like how to run remote meetings, how to run inclusive meetings in this environment, and how to keep the culture alive as well in that environment.
I've never thought about it like that before, but as different countries and locations are locking down and opening up and locking back down again, I guess that must have been a struggle just to even coordinate where people are, what people are doing, and coordinating. I never thought about this before, but coordinating that empathy that you are pushing out to your team of their situation and their circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely. We are very lucky to have a fabulous leader in Katie Burke who kind of really spearheaded this. And she had a team, I believe, of about 8 people at the time who kind of made all those decisions on communication on a company level. And then they collaborated and communicated with all of our country leads and heads of our different teams. And they were able to then kind of tailor that message down. But as you can imagine, I mean, it would have hit our Asian offices much more quickly than it hit Europe, I believe, was next, and then the US offices. So some offices were working as normal, while other offices were already feeling the impact of it.
Sure. We'll bring it back onto the data and the report in a second, but I'm fascinated by this. Is there anything that you think has happened culturally within HubSpot, the company culture? You guys are quite open about the culture that you kind of build, and you're proud of it. So it's all over the kind of homepage if anyone wants to check it out. I think there's a link in the footer on the homepage that talks about the company culture and kind of values and that side of things. I'll link it in the show notes as well. Is there anything that's changed internally within the company culture? Because empathy and communication and over communicating are perhaps things that can be added on top of everything else. Is there anything that's changed, especially when you're dealing with your sales managers, salespeople? Has anything changed culturally with communications, selling style, anything like that?
There's probably been a lot of changes. I think if we take kind of culture first, we've put, as I mentioned, a real emphasis on empathy, obviously, and I suppose it showed its face in multiple different ways across the company. So I'll use my own example. I'm a working parent. I was 8 months pregnant at the time, and I came home and my 2-year-old was then out of creche. So I was trying to juggle work as well as home life, as well as obviously being late in a pregnancy. So lots of things coupled together. And there was really nice examples of them putting on family programming. So for parents who were homeschooling, they had videos, dance classes, some education sessions, storytelling, and I used to put Emma in front of the TV to watch some of those, which gave me a little bit of time to do work. And it also brought people together because we had all of the kids on at the same time, and parents really bonded. And I think it gave us an insight into each other's lives to just a different depth than you normally get. And maybe that bond is quite special now that we have those relationships that were more of a work relationship in the past and have definitely deepened. And the other big one for us was kind of mental health, physical health, and just well-being. So again, I think HubSpot was very proactive here. We had a lot of staff who may have felt isolated, may have been in apartments on their own or in countries away from their home place, or just different scenarios that we find ourselves in with COVID. And they again put on lots of programming, lots of wellness examples there, exercise classes, fitness classes, and opportunities to socialize. And I think that was really important for people too. And again, built bonds that may not have existed beforehand. So we launched Modern Health recently, which is an employee benefit that gives access to coaching and therapy and mental health resources. And it's a really nice example of that.
That's amazing. The reason I asked and I wanted to dwell on that point was I've experienced the same with our team over at salesman.org. I now know them, everyone's remote over at salesman.org, but I now know them better from just asking for updates about how things are going along with the pandemic and what's going on in the different countries, because the team's all over the world at this point. And I now know them better than if I would have prior probably just plodded along what we were doing and kept this more formal kind of business relationship going. So the reason I asked those questions, Seona, is there's probably a few positive things that have come out of all of this. We talk about the negatives all the time, but the impact, and clearly the impact of COVID globally has been and it is still crazy, right? It's insane on a negative perspective, but there has been a few positives come from this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that relationship building from a team perspective is great. And when you know your team at that different level of depth, you have an idea of the perspective of where they're coming from, even in conversation and communication. And I think people have been helping each other out, even more. It's always been that environment in HubSpot where we help each other out, whether it's coaching someone, helping onboard new hires or our customers as well. But that's definitely been extended within COVID. It's been lovely.
For sure. Okay, so staying positive here as long as we possibly can. Is there anything that's happened while salespeople have gone remote that is positive for their performance? And I know that some of this is dependent on the marketplace and the economy and other things that are out of our physical control a lot of the time. But is there anything that's happened? Is there any evidence that salespeople, for example, who went remote quicker have performed better? Is there any evidence, or is there anything that salespeople should be doing right now to leverage the fact that customers are remote, we're remote, and anything we can do to improve selling performance across an organization?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of things that have kind of gone well post-COVID and staying on the positive note, yeah, I think there's a lot of really big positives that can be taken in terms of post-COVID, the impact that it's had on business structures and the way that we operate as businesses. Where if we take location as an example, I suppose we're all working from home. I don't think that's going to change, as many companies are already embracing remote working by hiring people who don't live immediately in the vicinity of their offices, for example. We certainly are here, and broadening that potential pool of employees is a really great thing. Not everyone can move county or city for work, and therefore it opens up a really great pool of candidates for companies, and it opens up nice work opportunities as well for candidates. So a win-win there, and a great value add from a diversity perspective as well. I do wonder, this is not something I've read coming up anywhere, but as a fellow or past backpacker, I do wonder for people who love to travel, is it going to open up the opportunity for people to travel while working, and some more interesting opportunities like that to arise in the future? But the flexible hours and flexible work arrangements, I think, is going to be the biggest positive for salespeople from that working environment. It's been really freeing for employees, especially those with children or families. And the survey that we did recently showed about 78% of people felt that improved flexibility, allowing working parents and carers to take on roles that they may not have previously been able to do. So a really nice uptick there.
For sure. And we could perhaps touch on flexible working hours and things like that in a second, because I think that's really valuable to salespeople. And it gives you a lot of the freedom that perhaps we talk about it as the cliche all the time of salespeople should treat their territory or their customers like they're an entrepreneur. They should try and grow them like a business. Well, being more flexible with your work hours perhaps allows a bit more of that entrepreneurial element to sales. So we'll perhaps come on that in a second, but you brought us back, I appreciate it, to the HubSpot Sales Enablement Survey. And another data point from it that I thought was interesting and worth drilling down with you, Seona, was 68% of sales leaders are going to implement a hybrid model moving forward. Because the reason I want to ask this question is we talk about remote selling, digital transformation. What does a hybrid model mean to yourself and HubSpot?
Yeah, absolutely. So a hybrid model, I suppose, would mean to me that you would have people who are working fully remote, people who are working from the office, and you may have people adopting something in the middle. So it's something that we've actually recently launched here in HubSpot, where all of our staff since January this year are able to choose one of the three options. They can be a fully remote member of staff, they can be a flex staff, or they can be an office-based member of staff. So for me, I've chosen flex. So it's nice to have a few days in the office, get all of the benefits and perks of that, and also have all of the benefits for being, at home and that environment as well. So the flex, from a company perspective, there's a few challenges around it. How do you treat everyone who is outside of this office in the same way as people within the office, from a career development perspective, from a culture perspective, from a perks perspective? So we're really rolling out everything kind of hybrid first or flex first, where we're trying to think of encompassing everyone in the organization with any initiatives that we roll out or benefits that we roll out. And I think that's something that we're working on at the moment.
Do you, fine if you don't know this, I can perhaps gather some data on this and put this in the show notes. But do you know what percentage of people have chosen each one of those routes of fully in the office, flexible, or remote?
Yeah, I won't give you the exact data percentage, but give or take, just over 40% of our employees chose the flex role. And then just under 40% chose the fully remote option, which left us with about 20% choosing the office-based role.
Sure. Does that 20% choosing to be in the office surprise you?
It doesn't surprise me. There's lots of benefits of being in the office. Some people love the social side of being in the office and the camaraderie of being in the office. There's a great learning opportunity in the office. Certainly, as a sales rep, I loved the learning by osmosis, just hearing people around me doing a great job and picking up tips and tricks there. And then also considering the environments that people live in. Again, some people may have a very busy household and find it difficult to engage in work from their home, or some people may be living on their own and be really craving that company as well from an office environment.
Yep, you sold me. That makes total sense. I think I always have a bias to this because I've always been in field sales, working for medical device companies. So we've never really had an office, to the point of Seona that the Christmas party that would be down, I'm in the north of England, for yourself in the audience, the Christmas party that was down in London every year, they would almost try and pay us off by giving us a bonus if we didn't go. That's how little they wanted us to come to the office. But yeah, you're right. But learning by osmosis, clearly that office environment can, especially if you're in a small flat, you've got kids running around. I've just got a puppy who's just chewing and attacking everything. So yeah, that would probably not be the most useful environment for me to be trying to sell out of and deal with customers as well. So I'll ask you this, but this is clearly going to be somewhat confidential information, and the data probably isn't there yet either. So we can perhaps ponder on it. Do you feel like there will be any performance difference between people who are in an office, remote, and flexible from the quota-carrying salesperson perspective? Because the reason I ask you this is, do you feel like some of this, not necessarily HubSpot, we'll talk wider across the sales industry here. Do you think some of these changes, this offer to work remote, could pivot back to an office environment if perhaps performance isn't quite there versus people who are remote versus people in an office environment in the future?
Yeah, I can't speak for companies in general in terms of the data points here, but it can certainly give a viewpoint on HubSpot because we've had this environment where we've had remote employees in the past, even pre-COVID, as well as our workers who worked a few days from home and fully office-based employees. We didn't see any difference in terms of attainment there. So it's interesting. I think giving people the opportunity to work in the best environment for them allows them to kind of fulfill their potential as such, and being able to tailor the environment that they work in based on who they are, based on their home environment. And I do think people will flex. So for example, as a mum of two young kids, right now that extra 30, 40 minutes in the morning and the evening that I would use to commute is so valuable. It's that extra time with them before they go to bed, and they currently go to bed at 7 o'clock in the evening. Fast forward maybe 5 or 6 years, I might be in a very different scenario, be delighted to get out of the house in the summer holidays when they're home and love to go to the office. And I might decide to choose something different. So I do think we'll flex over time.
Sure. And I guess some of this comes down to perhaps personality as well. Perhaps the more extroverted individuals, whether this is sales, management, whoever, might really thrive and gain energy from a busy office environment. Perhaps slightly more introverted individuals, like myself on occasion. Once I do these interviews, Seona, I want to sit down and just read a book for 5 minutes and recharge. Maybe I will do better, do my calls, emails, client and customer facing conversations, and then being able to just have lunch by myself with a bit of peace at home as opposed to in a busy office environment. So maybe personality comes into some of this as well. So we're talking about performance here. There's one other thing that really stood out to me, and having you on the show as a female sales leader, I think you can give some. You can talk about this perhaps more than what I can, and being with HubSpot and probably having a good idea on the data here as well. So the HubSpot survey shared that the percentage of women offered financial bonuses has dropped 8%, whilst only dropping 1% for men over this period that we're talking about. Why? I know there's not going to be a clear answer to this. There's going to be many, many variables, right? Clearly. But why do you think that is the case? What's going on here? Is it just men are outperforming women at the moment? Is there other factors involved? What's going on?
Yeah, that's a question that could start many a debate, Will.
Did you see how careful I was when I tried to set it up there?
You did. Very, very well played. No, I might refer back to the data on this one. I mean, in terms of our survey, we found actually that all signs performed to women outperforming their male colleagues since lockdown, which was interesting and a finding maybe I wasn't expecting there to be a difference, really. 60% of women agreed in particular that they had excelled during the pandemic. And I think that was quite interesting that it was put down to maybe leading with empathy while engaging with customers, and also some data to show that women were actually doing a little bit less of the face-to-face engagement pre-lockdown. So they didn't need as big of a shift when we moved into the lockdown itself. But it doesn't, I suppose, change the fact that the data on the financial incentives and the gap there, in the same period of time, the gap in financial incentives had widened to 23%, referencing that drop of 8% for women. And that's obviously something that isn't great to hear as a woman in sales. There's a few factors that might come into it. Men very much still occupy a lot of the senior positions. I think we're all aware of that in businesses. And there was definitely a recent analysis I'd read from Mercer on that showed it was somewhere just over 1,000 organizations had only about 23% of their executives were female. So if we think about the cuts that have taken place during COVID, these financial incentives are more like, or financial cuts are more likely to affect the junior staff. So I think that may have taken something into it. I'm pretty confident companies are not maliciously cutting their female staff salary, but equally they might not be considering how financial incentives affect different people within their workforce. And in sales especially, it's a performance-based business. Bonuses are part of the culture. They just need to be very sensitive when they handle it, I think. And maybe reading reports with data on the topic will help some companies to explore their own data and start a conversation within their business.
For sure. The reason I wanted to bring this up is, and you've outlined it, that a lot of this is muddled. And I see a lot of headlines, especially on LinkedIn, from individuals rather than brands or companies like HubSpot who have to be perhaps a little bit more conscientious with what they put out into the world, because people will call them out on it. And I think it's fascinating, and it seems like there's an opportunity for, as you just described there, a actual real in-depth study that has things like positions within an organization normalized. Using salespeople is a great example here, because you can normalize on performance. And I'd really love to suss out where the gaps are in here. I'm sure that there's massive gaps all over management, but for salespeople specifically, as you said, I've read studies and data that's shown that women are perhaps performing better than men at the moment. That perhaps, and this is a stereotype, but there is evidence to show this. All kinds of psychological studies that women perhaps are better geared and set up to have empathy, like a natural, like true empathy, as opposed to a sales bro pretending that he gives a damn about what's going on in the conversation. So I really love to like suss this out. And the reason the way I'm teeing this up now, Seona, is, do you feel like women are going to become not better, but more, how to say this? I feel like sales is a bro culture. Is that fair to say? Not necessarily HubSpot, but a lot of companies, and I can use myself. The last company I worked for, I didn't even fit in as a dude, right? They had mainly athletes and ex-military personnel, and I'm certainly not either one of them. So I was slightly not kind of fitting in with the company culture. Do you feel like that is coming to an end, as women clearly can outperform male sales professionals, at least perform alongside them? Do you think that there's, coming from a female sales leader, do you think that is perhaps the future of sales, of a truly kind of balanced sales force across the two genders?
I definitely think it is the balance is what we want to see between male and female in the organization. We know those teams overall perform better. In terms of that kind of bro culture that you've referenced, I couldn't comment on companies in general there. I've certainly read some of the articles you've mentioned as well online that may reference that for companies, but actually my experience has been incredibly positive in sales. I actually see sales as an incredible place to be as a woman. I've always been really welcomed in it. And that's not just in HubSpot, that's in the other companies I've worked in as well. And I think it's always been embraced, being a woman in sales, be it the male colleagues on my team or management, male or female, that I reported into. So I've actually been lucky enough that I haven't had any negative experiences there. But I do think we need to be very conscious and very deliberate in terms of, as leaders in a business, how do we ensure that every person who joins the team is feeling that way. Because there are differences that sometimes my own experience could lead to bias. If I've had a great experience, perhaps I'm not then recognizing that it's not the same level playing field for everyone. So how do we ensure and think about our culture from the moment that we interview people right through to the moment they're onboarded, how we include them in our team, and how we progress and develop our staff as such into leadership? How do we ensure that there's that balance across the board there? We're investing all of our people the same.
Amazing stuff. Well, I'll leave you with one final question before we wrap up. And that is, as a sales leader, sales director, is there anything you'd want to instill from HubSpot into the sales leaders who are listening to the show right now? Is there, if you had to choose one thing, whether it's culture, whether it's being data driven, whether it's a great product, whatever it is, what's the one thing that you'd really, post-COVID, want to share with our audience? Because tens of thousands of people are going to be listening to this. What's the one thing that you'd want to share with them?
I think it would be culture. Ultimately, if you create the right culture for your team, an inclusive culture and a culture that people kind of can grow in and be themselves in, ultimately you're going to retain staff. We've had incredible retention rates, and obviously it costs an awful lot to hire and to train your staff, so you want to retain them. And that culture means that people have been in HubSpot for a long time, and the value that brings to an organization is just incredible. So, lead with empathy, build the culture that people want to stay in, and it's only going to pay dividends for your business.
For sure. And to really emphasize that, I've been working with HubSpot for 6 years now. HubSpot really supported salesman.org and the different podcasts that we produce and the content we produce for our audience. It's actually slightly bizarre, the fact that the people I worked with 5-6 years ago are the same people that I'm working with now, because this doesn't happen in any other company. So clearly you guys are doing something right with culture, because as I said, that it's almost bizarre when I go to email someone a couple of years down the line when there's a new project coming up and it's the same person that I emailed years before.
Yeah, I love to hear that. It's a special place. It will take a lot for them ever to get rid of me. I'm here I've been here a while, and certainly plan to be here for a lot longer.
Amazing stuff. Well, I will link to the HubSpot Sales Enablement Survey in the show notes of this episode over at salesleadership.org. And with that, Seona, where can we find more about you? Can we add you on LinkedIn? Can we fire you a message on there?
Yeah, absolutely. On LinkedIn, and would love to hear from you. Thanks so much for the time today, Will.
You're welcome. And with that, Seona, thank you for joining us on the Sales Leadership Show.
Great. Bye-bye.